How's everybody doing this morning? Yes, 9:30, 10 o'clock legal talks. Let's do it. My name's Geoff. I'm a lawyer. Hold your applause. I also work with LexDAO. Next slide. But I'm actually a traditional lawyer. I still work in a law firm. This is what I look like when I'm trying to sell myself to boomers and non-crypto people. I'm a licensed attorney, so I'm a Canadian. In BC, Alberta, I'm a licensed attorney. And I our firm and my own expertise is in tax, estate,
Good
trust
stuff,
planning.
Man. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And corporate structures. But more relevant to the Web3 space, I've been in crypto since 2016. I teach a course to lawyers on how to integrate legal crypto issues into their practice and make them aware of what's going on in the space. They can get professional credit for that, which they need to keep their license. I work with LexDAO. I'm LEAF certified there, although I'm a really horrible Solidity developer. I've been doing a little bit of work with CaliDAO, and what my focus is right now is actually building a traditional law practice that focuses on giving good advice to DAOs and people in the Web3 space on tax, corporate structure, and trust issues. So next slide. So my goal here today is to kind of help DAOs navigate the space a little bit and spend less money and less time talking to lawyers like me. So how should DAOs prepare? And a lot of that comes down to understanding what your issues are before they show up in a bad way. So what I want to encourage DAOs to do is to try to think like lawyers, be like, what are our issues? How should we navigate these ahead of time? So before I talk, I need to give you the traditional thing. I'm not your lawyer. This isn't legal advice, blah, blah, blah. But there are good things to think about before you go see a lawyer. So next slide. So the three most common questions I get from DAOs are, is my token a security? What legal structure should we use? And how should we organize our finances? And there's no one good answer to this. Next slide. So the problem is that this depends on a whole bunch of issues. And this sounds like a trick from law firms and legal organizations in general, that if we tell you it depends and we tell you that we don't have a solid answer, then we get to keep bringing new clients in. Because if we just tell you the answer is do X, everybody does X and we don't have a recurring client base. But the real problem is that these legal issues are contextually dependent. They depend on the jurisdiction you're in, the type of business model you're running, the type way you're doing your tokens, if you're doing a token, how you have your multi-sig set up. There's a whole bunch of interesting issues that need to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. So unfortunately, there isn't one good answer for questions like, where should we establish our organization? Where should we use a Kali LLC to hype up Cali a bit more? Should we do a Cayman Islands trust? There's lots of different structures. There's not one size fits all for DAOs, and that's a bit of a problem. Next slide. But I am going to tell you three things that your DAO can do today that will help limit your ability to have legal issues in the future. Okay? So the first one is planning through some contingencies, doing some contingency planning. The second one is doing what I call a liability check. And the third one is siloing and layering your organization. So we're going to go through those one by one, and then I'm happy to take questions or talk to people afterwards about them in a bit more detail. Next slide. So contingency planning is all about thinking through every single contingency that may or may not happen with your DAO. Is my project going to be a success? Is my project not going to be a success? What happens if I do this? What happens if it fails? And a great example of this is kind of Constitution DAO, right? Great project, really cool idea, really hyped up community. When they didn't manage to win the auction they wanted to win, it was pretty clear now in hindsight, they didn't have a great plan on what to do in that situation. And that has introduced a whole bunch of interesting legal issues to their DAO. What I really encourage DAOs to do is to have a team call and to say, okay, what are we trying to do here? And what happens if we're successful? What happens if we make $1 billion? What are we going to do with it? What happens if we don't? What happens if our project fails and we create problems for our users? What are we going to do then? One of the things that I think that is really useful is working through those issues ahead of time. Because a lot of the calls I get from DAOs or people in the Web3 space are, hey guys, we have this issue that's happening in like 3 days, or we just had this issue arise in our DAO and we weren't prepared for it. And that creates a lot more cost, time, and money that the DAO has to spend fixing something that is broken rather than preparing for what might happen if something was to break. So that's what I encourage people to do, and I do this when I do estate planning all the time, is we do a lot of talks about what happens when you die. What happens if this person dies? What happens if your kids die before you? They're not super fun conversations, but they're super enlightening into how your DAO will survive if good things happen or if bad things happen, and how you can maximize both opportunities. The second thing I want people to think about is to do a liability check. So who holds the liability in your DAO, right? If something goes wrong, whether it's an SEC and a security thing, whether it's some sort of other hack issue, is there people in your DAO who are holding liability? Most likely, those people are going to be the multi-sig holders holding your treasury and the core contributors, because those are the people that courts would tend to look to as organizational leaders who have control, command and control over the organization, even in the case that it's a fully decentralized DAO, right? Does your DAO need a legal contingency fund to protect those individuals? I think it, in a lot of ways, like a great example of this was on Indexed, I'm forgetting, who had the hack, and they're now in the lawsuit in Ontario, Canada, trying to recover money from somebody who kind of exploited one of their contracts. They had to go back to their community to ask for money, to ask to use the treasury to fund that lawsuit. I think that it would be wise for DAOs as they grow to think about putting aside 0.5%, 0.25% of their treasury as a sort of internal legal liability insurance, right? Think about how you're going to structure your DAO to protect yourself, your leaders, your core developers, and your community in the event that somebody launches a lawsuit against the DAO. Lawsuits, unfortunately, aren't cheap. They're especially not cheap in this space because of the expertise that's required, okay? But thinking through, as a community, who is the most exposed, who's doxxed, who isn't, is a really useful exercise to understand what your liability might be and what kind of, when you may need to go see a lawyer to kind of protect the core members of your community who are contributing a lot of value, or the community as a whole. The other thing that I really encourage people to do if they are core contributors or they are kind of multi-sig holders is to not do that individually. Do that through a corporation that you incorporate in whatever jurisdiction it is. So I'm Geoff. I can set up a Geoff LLC. In Canada, we call it just a corporation. Geoff Ltd is going to be the person who's actually holding the tokens for the multi-sig, or is actually holding the seed phrase for the multi-sig that I'm doing. That way, if something goes wrong, it may not be the ultimate lifesaver, but it's great to have a piece of paper to hold up to say, don't come after my house, don't come after my family. I am actually operating this through a corporation, and therefore I have some sort of protection. Okay, it's a great thing to do. It's super cost effective. You got to talk to a local attorney for that, but it's a super great way that's, again, cost effective and scalable for your core team, multi-sig holders, to start operating not as personal individuals, but as corporate individuals. Pardon me? Because it's easier to set up for the purpose of this, and there's some tax issues that may be at play depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Sorry, the question was why local? It's easier to set up corporations locally and cheaper in your own state than it is to set them up in exotic locations like Switzerland for purposes like this, where there's only going to be one shareholder, only one director, yourself, and you're just going to be holding you're just basically doing some documents up to say, I'm holding these tokens as a corporation, not individually. You just want to find the easiest way to do it, not the most exotic way to do it. There are tax issues involved in that sometimes. So it's also worth talking about, if you live in California, if you live in New York, what some tax consequences are of that, because it may be better to set up in a different state, different jurisdiction. But again, that varies on a case-by-case basis. Okay, next slide. So the other thing that I think is useful is siloing and layering. So apps like Kali make it really, really easy to spin up a DAO. You're basically just paying gas fees to do that. So why not do that lots of times to help create an organizational structure for your DAO that both provides some legal layering, right, in the case of multiple different LLCs or corporations, and also helps you do your accounting. So I practice a lot of tax, and one of the things that comes up in tax all the time is figuring out what your specific expenses and receipts are so that you can claim them back in the form of tax credits, and that's obviously dependent on what you're purchasing, what you're engaged in. So example, paying, if you want to do a movie project, a Blockbuster DAO, doing some movies, there's a lot of tax credits available to those kind of projects if they know how to claim them. And one of the things you need to do to claim them is to prove you spent it on the right thing. So if you set up sub DAOs, so let's say you have a Geoff DAO, and then I want to do a bunch of things. I want to buy some real world assets. I want to buy some NFTs. I got to pay some kind of contractors or employees to build our website. Set up sub DAOs for those. Put all of the tokens for those, those sub DAOs in the head DAO, and now you've got like an automated accounting structure that makes it really easy for you after the fact when you think about doing taxes. If that's a thing your DAO wants to do. I do recommend paying taxes, just the smallest amount that you possibly can. That lets you better organize your DAO's expenses so that you can claim back potential tax credits or just keep track of your finances in a better way, right? So there's a growing field of accounting in this space. Being able to point them directly and say, this is our account we buy all of our assets with. Here's all the purchases. Using the tools provided by DAO summoners or your proposals to say, like, this purchase is for blah, 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 makes it really easy for then an accountant to go back, whether it's a year later, 3 years later, and say, okay, I see what was happening here. Here's some ways we can like find tax efficiencies. Here's some ways that we can understand what the DAO is doing. A lot of times what I see with DAOs is like they have a conversation on Discord. We're going to buy this thing. We're going to do this thing. Okay, put a proposal in and do it. The proposal doesn't have any sort of kind of description in it. And then suddenly 3 years later, nobody knows what that was for. It's just money that left the treasury. So the goal is to kind of find ways to like tag that, make sure you know what it was for. That helps from a liability perspective. And again, from my world, it also helps from a tax and accounting perspective. So next structure, next slide. So this is kind of an example of something you could do, right? The other thing is that a lot of, especially NFT projects, generate or potentially could generate intellectual property. It's an old school thing to basically hold back and say, we should put our IP, what actually owns the intellectual property, in a different corporation than the operating corporation, so that if anything happened and we got sued, that those IP assets wouldn't be attackable by a lawsuit necessarily. So that's one way you can do that. And Cali, again, to plug Cali, is a great way to spin up an LLC in Delaware, a series LLC in Delaware, that allows you to kind of hold those assets potentially in a different way, in a different kind of structure, and protect them, okay? But I've got here, so I've got head DAO, I've got a cap DAO, which is basically for capital expenses, and then I've got a pay DAO, which is kind of for payments for people. And if you have a budget as a DAO, you can just set up sub DAOs for each one of your big expense categories and flow the money through those to make it really clear how our budget's operating, where our money is going, and how we can then capitalize on some of the tax efficiencies that might be available to us. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I hope I didn't bore you too much. There's lots of lawyers coming up today, so I didn't want to be too long. Again, my name's Geoff. I'm with LexDAO. I'm also with Lindsay McCarthy LLP in Vancouver. Definitely send me an email if your DAO needs help. Definitely check out LexDAO. We're great. If I can't help you, I'm in Canada, so sometimes I'm limited on that. We can definitely help you find lawyers. There's a growing kind of number of lawyers who understand this space, who are degens themselves. Jordan, I'm looking at you, and who are able to give you really, really good advice for your DAO. And to be honest, as intimidating as it is to go and talk to a lawyer, the earlier you do it, the less you will likely spend on a lawyer in the long run, okay? Thank you so much. I ended a bit early. I know that they want their time back, and that's right. If you have questions, come find me afterwards.